Good evening, everyone. Tonight is November 20th, 2024. It is 6:07 p.m. and I would like to call to order a joint Planning Commission and City Council meeting. Our first order of business is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please join us.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda for tonight?
I'll make the motion to approve the meeting agenda.
And is there a second?
This is Scott. I'll second.
Any questions or discussion? I'll call for the vote, starting with Ron.
Ron, aye.
Bethany, aye.
Sue, aye.
Lynn, aye.
Scott, aye.
Janet, aye.
Susan, aye.
Rob, aye.
And Jesse, aye. So the agenda has been approved, but before we go further, I would like to introduce our newest member of the Planning Commission, Susan Bausch.
Bouch.
Bausch.
Coach with a B.
All right. So she lives up on Kettle, right? Or on
Broadway.
Broadway.
By the tree farm.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You forgot
Thank you for having me.
Robin for the
Oh,
vote.
Robin. Oop.
Uh-oh.
How do you vote on the agenda, Robin? Oh, you're on mute. Oh, we can't hear you yet.
Nice.
You could put your thumb up.
Put your thumb up if it's an aye. Ta-da.
Right.
All right. So anyway, back to Susan. Thank you for what you have signed up for. Thank you for all the work you're going to do. And everybody,
Welcome.
welcome.
Well,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
And it's Bausch?
Bouch.
Bausch,
Coach with a B.
just like it's spelled. Right? All right. So on quickly to item number 4, the approval of the October 2nd, 2024 Joint Planning Commission and City Council meeting. And I've been informed that we're going to remove that until the next meeting because there are some typos or things that
Something
didn't get
missing,
printed on
so.
there.
There's some things that I missed in there.
So we'll bring that up next time. On to item number 5, the public open forum. Is there anyone who would like to speak at the open forum, in person or online? Seeing none, we'll move on. And our next issue is the presentation and discussion of the Cannabis Ordinance. So who wants to take that? Dean?
I'll start.
All right.
So in the last several weeks, Eleanor and Megan and I have had a chance to talk about, first of all, the original draft of the ordinance, and then I finished that and forwarded it on to Megan, and you have an edited version of that. And my handout to you is just numbered 1 through, 18 or 19, 20. And we'd like to cover them in that order, and they're in sequence in the text, tells you what page number, what reference, and what the issue is. And there will be some questions as we go along, some decisions. And at the end, there's some final things that we need to do. And any other comments, recommendations, or changes that you have that weren't included in what Megan and I put together, we'll talk about. Our goal is to get out of here tonight, not only as early as possible, but with a recommendation maybe to set a hearing. But we'll see how many questions you have. And so let me just start in that page 1. You can see on Megan's highlighted version of the ordinance, it's highlighted in blue. This is an issue throughout the text. After our last discussion and before you saw this draft of the ordinance, which was dated October 18th, we had talked about the state potentially creating a licensing program or registration program for the lower potency hemp edibles, which are not, and you have some in your community now. We put them in as a placeholder in this document, and that was one of the first things that Megan flagged and simply said, under this definition of retail business, if we're going to leave lower potency in, then we got to make sure we are going to do that and add them to the licensing provisions along with the other retail businesses. We didn't do that because we're not certain we want to do it. We're not certain the state's registration is going to happen sooner than later. And even if they register the lower potency, it may be allowed to exist without our regulation. And originally, when we first met, we handed out the draft ordinance or a model ordinance that was prepared by the office that indicated in there that this is strictly an option for you. And we need you to give direction one way or another, but there will be a lot of changes in this document, and we'll hit them as we go through. But the big question is, does anybody want to go out of the way to regulate these, or do you want to leave it the way it is now?
I just have a question and how this would fit in, but do we know how Forest Lake regulates like nothing but hemp? Because I was at a vendor show last week and they had a table and they're giving out samples and selling things. What if they came to Fall Fest and wanted to be a vendor? Do we have to have some type of license or restriction for that?
I would say this, if it's lower potency, it fits that category, it's not an other cannabis category with the higher levels of THC, and they're currently not regulated, it'd be no different than somebody bringing caramel apples to Fall Fest.
Okay.
Because we're not regulating them. And I don't think any of us envisioned that we would create regulations that were unnecessary. It's just that this draft of the document sets it up, and you'll see it in the section later that identified the potential to regulate these. We added them as categories in conditional use or interim use section. And if you don't want to do that, it's all coming out. You would leave it unregulated the way it is today. And if the state regulates it, it doesn't mean that we have to in the direction that we predict.
And so just to follow up, these are the products that have been permitted since 2018, 2019 in the Farm Bill. And so they are there is THC in them, but they most importantly are sold in a number of your existing retailers. And we want to be thoughtful that if this is something that the city does want to license, that we create a separate license category to preserve those existing sales, so that we're not restricting your existing retailers' rights to sell the products that they have already been selling at this point in time.
So, Dean, what you're looking for is if we want to add a special category or not.
Does anybody want to regulate these? Raise your hand. If you don't raise your hand. I think we predict where you're going, but I can see Janet has a...
No, I just have a question for Megan. Why would we want to? I mean, what would be the pros and cons of, obviously the cons are it's more work and, why, but so why would you want to regulate them?
So I don't think that there is a significant benefit in regulating them. I think that they have functioned very successfully at this point in time without any sort of known harms. The only reason to regulate them is that they are within this category of products. This is the opportunity for us to set up the licensing structure to do so. But I do not think that there is a strong policy basis for adding this to your new regulations.
Okay, thank you.
If the state, I'll just add, if the state decided that we did have to create some form of regulation, we're going to have a couple of years to do that. Right now, their position is that they're going to register them, but it wasn't implying that communities have to. And so we honestly don't see any reason to do this. And so all of those definitions that included the low potency edibles or even the hemp consumer products, you don't want to regulate T-shirts and all that kind of stuff just because it says hemp on them. So we'd pull all of that out of this draft. The only one exception was a low potency edible manufacturer. We need to add that as a category and identify what district, and there are two that we would leave I think that was general business and light industry. But as I say, when we come to that, we'll highlight that. And so if your direction is what you seem to be giving us, then the definition, this first item, would eliminate low potency, and it'll be the heavy-duty stuff. That's all we're going to regulate and license.
All right, everybody, do we want to regulate the heavy-duty stuff and not the rest of it? Anybody who wants to regulate the heavy-duty stuff, raise your hand.
Well, I don't think that's the question. It's the, do we want to regulate, you have to regulate the heavy-duty stuff.
Yes,
It's the-
but do we want to regulate the rest of it?
Oh,
Anybody want to?
no.
No, sir.
Okay, Dean, there's your
Okay.
answer.
The second one I'm going to turn over, it's on page 3. It was it almost looked like a duplicate definition, place of public accommodation and public place. I had inserted public place because it was included in Ordinance 23-06, which was our cannabis in public places nuisance provision. And Megan was going to look into that. She was just worried about language.
Exactly right. And so the original definition of public place incorporated, and we do not use it frequently in terms of how we're regulating it. This is a nuisance category. As you may recall, we adopted a no smoking policy within our public parks already, and that's been in place for a number of years. So a public place is currently defined as any publicly or privately owned place that is open to the general public regardless of any fee or age requirement, including but not limited to parks, trails, sidewalks, streets, parking lots, plazas, shopping areas, stadiums, or sporting facilities. So what I would like to do is limit this definition to be more reflective of what are our public regulation areas, and so restrict it to parks, trails, sidewalks, streets, parking lots, and any publicly owned property. Because my concern is that if we are, so we're, the impact of sort of regulating a larger scale public place with the breadth of this definition would be to be regulating all different types of THC use within any potential building that's open to the public. And unlike non-smoking bans or smoking bans, THC could be beverages, it could be served at a local bar or restaurant. And so just the breadth of, I think, means to start a little bit more narrowly, so it's guided towards where you're allowed to utilize these substances.
Any questions, anyone?
So this is Rob. Question on the park thing. I know we did that. It was a couple years ago now. I think we changed that ordinance or about use in the parks and things. Does that then exempt them from, like, say, a fall fest if it was like a full-fledged THC? That would eliminate that for us, right?
Yes, and in term, if Fall Fest was to have this as part of its offerings, we would do that as a THC special event, and that has another section that fully regulates it as well. Sure.
So like in that event, like the Lions, they had to have a fenced off area. Would that be a similar thing? It would have to be somewhere where kids couldn't get at or in. Have to get a wristband.
Substantially regulated, okay. Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.
No other questions? Then the next one on the same page, the issue or the question from Megan's perspective was perhaps think about starting out 1, and we can amend the ordinance and do 3 later. As you've heard me say, with the competition that's happening, the limited market we have, the absence of existing buildings or facilities that are adequate for somebody to come in and easily lease and convert to a business isn't as likely as we think. We have to have one. Keep in mind, if you have more than one application, it is first come, first serve. And if you had a second or third application, you could come back and amend your ordinance and say, we're going to have 2 or 3 or whatever. But I think early on in the process, we talked about, is there any local interest that might really be pursuing this opportunity from a retail perspective? And if so, the risk is that somebody else beats them to the punch and they take up your application. But it doesn't prevent us from amending our ordinance saying we're going to issue more than one.
So this is Rob on this topic. I thought we had already voted on this, and that was the tiebreaker.
We did, but we've brought it up for discussion each time.
So we voted on it actually twice. So here's my thing is, we discussed it and we voted on it twice and it was 3. So I just feel like keeps coming up, and once you vote on it, we should stick. It shouldn't be waffling back and forth because we have people watching us on how we're going to handle things. And if we keep changing our mind all the time, and it was voted on twice, so I feel like that's a pretty significant thing, that now where we're going to vote 3 times and then we're going to change our mind, then we really don't know what we're doing.
Well, I'll fall on the sword here as the new person to the ordinance drafting party. So just as some background, and understood that 3 has been voted on and is the preference of the boards, the approach that cities are sort of taking is to ensure that they're calculating the number of potential users and making sure that there are sufficient licenses for the number of users that are required under the law. And so for the city of Edina, for example, they have a minimum of 5 retail licenses that they need to issue or have available. Now, who knows if there are going to be 5 retailers, they're going to select the city, of course. But that's their minimum, and they elected to go with 5. Similarly, the city of Bloomington has a higher number of licenses that they must provide. They went with that baseline number. So the trend has generally been, from a legislative perspective, to start with the number of licenses that you must have, and then always can amend those upwards. And that was just the underlying policy basis for suggesting this for your discussion.
So I have one question. This is Sue, and I was a proponent of the 3 because we wanted to leave it open for, we just didn't want to hinder anybody's business. But is there any other reason? Because in thinking about it, we really don't know what all of the regulations are going to be, and it could be, we just don't know what could happen by allowing 3. So can you see any other reason besides what the other cities are doing that would be a benefit for us to go with 1 instead of 3?
It's just more control on your part. So in terms of process, and this is something that Dean and I talked about along with Eleanor, the process itself is, in terms of becoming a licensed retailer, is quite fraught. And in the last day, there was just an article announced from the Office of Cannabis Management. They rejected, I think, 2/3 of the social equity applicants. Those applications were just rejected as being insufficient. So the path towards licensure at the state is going to be a difficult one. And I think that you all have talked about sort of what the process looks like here, which is an applicant will need to identify an area within the city, within a potential retail space that would be appropriate for their use. They'll have to check that with city staff and ensure that their reading of the zoning ordinance is accurate, and city staff will have to sign off on that, not on a conditional use permit or anything like that yet, but to have the location established. Then they'll go up for licensure, and they'll have that vetting conversation with the state office. And then once all of that is finalized, they can come back to you for their conditional use permit and their local license. And so I think the question is the benefit of having a larger number of licenses is it allows sort of a running track record, so that if someone comes in, applies for, does some of the initial zoning review, then goes for licensure, is licensed, or maybe is held up in the licensure process, and then someone else comes in, that you have for a different space perhaps, then, they haven't put the effort into engaging with the city and then have the one license taken. Now, that process is going to take between 6 months to a year from start to finish for a new retail license within the state of Minnesota. So if you had that second candidate, either you can have it as part of having 3 permitted underneath your licensing ordinance, or alternatively, when you have that second candidate coming in, you would have plenty of time to amend upwards. So the true benefit is just having stricter controls to start and to license within the very limits of your authority as compared to being more flexible. And those are completely policy choices that are available for this board to make.
Yep. So Lynn, I understand what you're saying about, we did vote, but it was just a direction. We weren't voting on the actual.
Right.
So I would be okay with revoting if everybody else is.
I mean, I'm okay with it. We've spent so much time
Yep.
each meeting, and now now we have a different perspective because you weren't here when we were here, but it was just, I seen it on the agenda, and I'm just like, how many times do we have to, keep doing something? And is there really the benefit to go to one that great? Or, but now we have Megan's perspective, which we didn't have before, so we can re-vote. I just don't want to spend a ton of time on it.
Anyone else? Rob?
No, I only brought it up for the point I thought we'd moved on for it, but I'm fine if we want to revote, so, yeah. But just feels like I'm a carpenter, you put a wall up, tear it down and build it again. That's the point.
It's so much easier to put up a wall.
So do we need to vote again, or are we?
Or can we just say one?
I think we're looking for consensus in terms of what to adopt within your ordinance and present back to you. Now, you're going to get a chance to vote on the entirety of the ordinance when we hold the public hearing. But no, I think that we would like to hear individual consensus basis here so that we have a sense of what to finalize in our ordinance. Would you concur with that, Dean?
It's pure policy. I have no preference. And since we invited Megan into the process, she is always going to offer a different perspective. And, you listen to it. And if you want to change, it doesn't matter, honestly.
Yeah.
So we've introduced new information here, and I don't think it's inappropriate to get a consensus feedback. It takes, 30 seconds to vote? Again, now considering the new information, I think it's appropriate.
Yeah.
All right, everybody, we're going to have a vote then.
So what are we voting?
Yeah, what are we voting on?
So you're voting 1 or 3?
Either 1 or 3.
Well,
We'll say
about you
one,
just say
yes or
one.
no to 1.
Okay,
and then
so I'll call is there a second for a motion to adopt 1? What's the look?
We don't have to do a motion.
we don't have
no.
to do a motion.
Okay, what's the consensus then? For only one permit, starting with Ron.
We'll start on the other side. I'm okay with 3.
Okay. So that's a no on the 1.
Oh, that's what you want, no.
Yep.
Yeah.
No.
Aye.
Aye for 1.
Aye for 1.
I'm changing my vote for an aye for 1.
And that's, we can do that. I'm just going to say I'm fine with 3.
And I'm fine,
So no.
okay.
Yeah, I was 1 before, I'm still 1.
I'm 1.
I'm 3.
Rob, 3.
And Jesse, sorry, Robin?
3.
3. You got to find your unmute button there. And I'll go for 3. So what's the total?
3.
Counselor?
3.
I think that's 3. It's still
3.
So that's 3.
Wonder if somebody's keeping
Yep.
count.
6 to 5.
All right.
Okay?
So what's next?
So, page 4. When we first spoke about the licensing provisions. The state had come out with a one-page checklist, if you will. And that language in the law was when they make a preliminary referral, you have 30 days to act on this. And I wrote this provision coming up with the notion of a preliminary cannabis license approval. And after we talked about it, Megan's conclusion was we are allowed to have the language that unless they are fully vetted and have an approval from the state, we're going to reject it. And so her first strike through, 41005, eliminates the necessity for that. And that, again, was to merely meet the state's request that we respond in 30 days. And so what we'll do with that is to say, if they send a referral to us that says there's no zoning district, we're going to reject it and say we have no idea. If they have a zoning district and it's eligible, but they haven't come here and talked to us about a local permit, we're going to write, they have a box, and we're just going to say, we can't approve this until we go through our process. And so that's what's said in 41006. The revision is that we're not going to respond favorably unless they're licensed by the state.
And this really follows our traditional planning and zoning path here. There are times, yes, there is sort of this complicated licensing structure at the state level that they'll need to jump through to open. But that's often the case when a business comes in looking for a potential site. And so from a policy standpoint, what we would recommend is that the city adopt an internal policy for its planning and community development team to respond to requests from potential licensees about whether or not their proposed site is within the zoning district. To add a supplemental sort of pre-licensure or pre-approval licensure, I think unnecessarily creates a property right in that pre-approval license that is not then vetted by the ultimate licensing board with the state. And for us, I think in terms of from our public safety and nuisance conditions questions, our most significant review is going to be at that state level, making sure that the applicant can comply with all of the rules the state has put into place and the background vetting that the state is going to do. So in terms of process, and again, this is sort of what I was describing when we were talking about the number of potential licenses. In terms of process, the state will still send us that form. We will respond to it as we are available to respond to it and as is appropriate in terms of where the potential licensee desires to locate. Yes, it can be in this zoning district. No, it can't be in this zoning district. Or yes, it can be in the zoning district subject to these particular conditions. Then they'll go through their licensing process and then they'll come back to us and they'll seek a local license as well as all of their zoning approvals once they have the state license in hand.
So initially, Megan commented that this licensing procedure can take 6 months, maybe a year. In the amended laws this year, it indicates what they have to do if they are vetted in the first round. So they get a pre-approval. Part of that process says in the new language in the statute, that's when they come to us, they go to the bank, they find a site. And so for them, this still aggravates me. You know, I was upset in the beginning to say you have 30 days to approve it. And by the way, if you don't, we can approve it. Was nonsense when you really look closely at the law that says they don't have to have a site. They don't have to have anything. It's their preliminary vetting, which is why that preliminary approval process was put in there. If we can skip that, and that's Megan's comfort level, I'm all for it. We don't want any more rigmarole than whatever. But after somebody gets preliminary approval, they've got 6 months to a year to go and get all of their final approval from the state, including talking to us. And so this is simply going to say they can't come here without having something more substantive. We may reject one that had no contact with us, they're going to start contacting us, and we can start going through the motions of our formal approval, but it's going to be contingent upon the state giving them formal approval also. It'll be two-step. So what Megan's done simplifies what seemed like nonsense to begin with, and so I'm happy. And if you're in agreement, 1005 will come out of there, and then we'll rewrite the other. Okay, good. Everybody's on the same page.
I do have one quick question, and I don't know if it's related to that or not, or if we're going to talk about, Megan, your couple pages, your memo in here separately. But there was one thing about, and it was on your page 2, page 9 of the packet, that first paragraph talks about how Bloomington and Edina regulate their business similarly to the city, aligned with the state law, includes background checks, site-specific compliant investigations, and annual renewals. Is that something that's in the state regulations, or do we have to did they put that in there and we have to put in there about renewals? And
Yep, so we have an annual renewal process within our licensure period, just like we utilize for our alcohol licensing. So our cannabis license will look almost identical to your existing alcohol license.
oh, okay. All right, thank you.
All right, the next section is under 41007. Megan suggested, even though we have a number of these provisions in our performance standards, that they be reiterated, or at a minimum, this list be included in the licensing provisions. I have absolutely no problem with that, other than you'll see in item A, which talks about hours of operation, we're going to strike lower potency hemp edibles and hemp derived products, because we're not going to regulate that. They won't be subject to those hours. So whatever hours you do, if you'll go to page 12 on this list, we have retail hours of operation as a part of the performance standards, and these two sets are different. What I gave you in this first one, and it has a note included on page 12 where I explain, the state allows these to be open, or excuse me, the maximum was businesses would be closed between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m., but we can require opening at 10 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. We can also allow them to close at 10 p.m. instead of 2 a.m. We've never, as a group, really looked hard on what those are, but keep in mind, this isn't going to affect the current low potency. It'll be these new retail shops, period, just the retail businesses. And you have to have a comfort level. We've got the racetrack and liquor sales there at late hours. Do you want this to go to 2 in the morning, or is it 10 a.m. to 10 p.m.? Because what's included on page 4 are different hours than were on page 10, and this is pure policy. I could care less. We took what the state indicated was, cutting back those hours, starting a little later in the day and closing a little earlier at night. But if you want people to be able to buy pot until 2 in the morning, the state allows that. So we just have to pick, because right now we have different standards. Megan?
Yeah, and so I just wanted to say, I looked at that one in particularly and went, why in the heck would we do that? If something is open, if we have a business that's open, it's open until 2 in the morning, why would you stop telling them they can't sell their stuff between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.? Makes no sense to me at all. So if their hours are till 10 p.m., well, that would make sense. But I don't know why we would limit the hours. Kids are in bed by 10 usually, so it shouldn't matter.
I also have no opinion on this. So whatever the council and the planning commission recommends is excellent.
Okay.
If you were operating your own police force, a lot of communities look at this You know, what are the issues? Why do bars close perhaps at midnight on weeknights and maybe 1 o'clock? Some communities go the max and they're 2 o'clock. This is pure preference. My only point is to note the difference in the two sections, and we want to make them identical. So you need to decide what hours are suitable.
Any other opinions besides Sue's?
I'm just really confused. Are you saying that we should make the retail and the micro business the same hours? Or, because the micro business can sell too on site, right? So are you just talking about the retail, or are you talking about both?
This is strictly retail licensing in this provision. So this is the dispensary that's being regulated by hours, just like a liquor store. And so the state says we can't require them to open later than 10 a.m., but they allow them to open at 8 a.m., except Sunday. That's 10 a.m. So again, people come up with the numbers. It's what your comfort level is. Do you need to have a dispensary open at 2 a.m.? That's what the state would allow you to do. Or are your other retail businesses pretty much done by midnight?
But on page 12, it does include the micro business in the hours. That's why I'm confused. So
I
under
can't find page 12 either.
page 12 of 13.
Is it way down here?
Looking at under L.
Under L.
Thank you. There we
That's why I'm confused.
Yeah, under L, yep.
I'm sorry, that's my page number in the original ordinance. It may be different in your packet
In the
page.
packet, it's
10 p.m.
page 22.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that's okay. And which letter?
L.
So again, I think that the distinction between these two areas is one is our retail license and the other one is a performance standard related to the zoning ordinance. So the retail hours of operation on page 12 are limitations on any conditional or interim use permit that is issued for either a retail business or a let's see, micro business, and whereas your retail license ordinance is just related to those retail shops only, so that's why it's limited. But again, the hours of operation should mirror one another in both sections.
So this is Rob. Currently, there's liquor stores that are selling these things already, right? And they're regulated from whatever the liquor store hours, so it'd be easy just to match what they're doing. I mean,
Well, are you talking about the low?
there's THC drinks,
Not the high stuff, though.
10, 15
non-regulated.
milligrams. I don't know what's high. That seems high to me.
Yeah.
Maybe not in Columbus, maybe, no.
You can go to Bill's, you can go to MGM, you can go wherever you want and buy it right now, right up next to Quick Trip. THC,
Okay, then I'm really
CBD mix.
confused. I thought that this ordinance was regulating something different than what's already being out there now.
So the products that you can purchase today in Bill's or at MGM are all the low potency hemp.
They're low?
Material.
Okay,
Yeah.
wow.
Yes. Yeah.
High potencies, like.
It's just a whole new world, Rob.
Rob thought it was pretty high, no?
How does that feel, Rob?
It's all new to me.
Have you been spending too much money for something?
So I guess my
Thanks for
question,
clarifying that.
so we need
Seems
to
like it.
match, but I guess my question is, if we are going to dictate the hours of business for these cannabis retailers, they should be able to sell during the hours that they're open. So if we are, in this on page 12, are we saying these are going to be their hours of operation?
Yep, their maximum hours.
Their maximum hours of operation.
If they chose to close earlier, that would certainly be within their discretion.
Okay, so as long as what they can sell matches their hours of operations, I
Yeah,
think that would.
there's no restriction on what they can or can't sell. Many of these businesses will have the lower potency items, and then the question there would be, well, wait a minute, are you restricting our sales if we stayed open past your midnight deadline? Can't we still sell the lower potency? Technically, yes, they can.
Yeah.
And they'll have both. They'll have the low potency and the full stuff. And so this is going to be rewritten where we're not regulating any low potency. So whether they're going to the gas station to get that or a new dispensary, they'll have the same opportunity with the lower potency. But the retail stores, or we had to include the micro business because it has a retail license also, it should have the same hours as the dispensaries. And so the question is, do you want them open until 10, 11, 12? The suggestion here was, moderate. It was not the maximum. 10 in the morning till midnight on certain days of the week, and then more restrictive on others. You just have to pick. Again, it's a non-issue for us.
Where do liquor stores go? They can't open on Sunday till what time? Is it 9 or?
I think it's 10 o'clock.
Huh?
I think it's 10.
Is that the same hours they have here?
I did not bring my code book. That's where we would find that.
What time does church get done?
Depends on which
10
church you
o'clock.
go to.
Let's see what MG is.
Well, it's just,
think it's-
gee whiz.
I thought it was 9 a.m.
Wait.
Or is that on sale?
We'd have to look at chapter 4. Do you want to mirror the hours identical to your liquor?
That's the way I look at it. Why?
Yeah,
Yep.
What time is it?
Pretty fine.
I'm looking up
Oh.
Gee Whiz Liquors and Lino
Will
Liquors.
Liquor.
Gee
Oh,
Will.
do you call it whiz?
Okay, Gee Will Liquors. I don't know, because I
Don't you
don't.
have that on quick dial?
So Sue, one of the things you said, I was thinking about, like the one establishment we have in Columbus, which is Running Aces. So they're open 24 hours, but they have to stop serving liquor at 2 or whatever the time is. So that would be an example of where they can't sell all the hours that they're open. So when you say you'd like to see them be able to sell, I mean, if they ended up being one of our licensees, they would not be able to sell all the hours that they're open. But because the state would limit that. So, I mean, I'm with Ron. I mean, I would mirror the liquor hours.
I think it's
I
simple.
agree. So the liquor store in Lino Lakes is open 8 to 10 Monday through Saturday and 11 to 6 on Sunday.
Yeah, I think you were right about 11.
Not that I ever go to a liquor.
Okay, but
No,
that's
sure.
off sale, not on sale.
Okay, here we go.
You're
close to
talking on
MGM.
sale.
All right, I've got it. I'll tell you what your ordinance currently says.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So for liquor, the hours and excuse me, let's start over again. The hours of operation and days of sale shall be those set by Minnesota statutes, as it may be amended from time to time, except that the city may by resolution or ordinance provide for more restrictive hours than the state law allows. So at this point in time, you defer to the state law on hours of operation for liquor. And so as originally proposed in the zoning ordinance, we could simply defer to the OCM standards for max operations. And that would be consistent with how you treat alcohol.
Okay, so then that would, like, say, for example, if Running Aces did have one and they were selling it where they sell alcohol, they could sell that till 2 o'clock when they sell their alcohol, and then they'd be done.
Yep, yes, as currently permitted by the Office of Cannabis Management.
Okay, and that makes sense to me.
I like that.
I'm good with that.
Simple.
Same.
I like that. It's simple.
So do you need a consensus, or what would you like?
I think we have it, the consensus that I'm sensing from the boards here, that we can align this with the state law, and that's sufficient in both sections.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, moving along. And my page 5, not your page 5, I'm sorry, if you look at the small print on the handout that you've got, it has page 5 of 13. There's a title revision at the top. Megan just thought this is, let's call it a compliance check, not an age verification. It is what it is, but a compliance check is fine. Inserted in here is a requirement if we do cause a suspension that we do have to hold a public hearing. That's consistent with due process for anybody. And so Megan's inserted that. She inserted another sentence in the bottom of that paragraph about reinstating when they've been resolved by us or OCM. And those are all appropriate revisions, so we'll make those. And then on the next page, 4-1017 is another title change. I want to change that again. Not only add temporary event, but call it cannabis temporary event, because that's the title we use throughout. So that's the only change there. At the bottom of the page, even though we probably have 12 or 15 severability clauses spread out in our city code, Megan thought it would be appropriate, and I don't disagree. It's kind of cover your rear here.
That's exactly right. This is an evolving area of the law. So whatever gets, whatever all of the cities get told, we can't do these things. All right, well, we strike those and we move on with the things that have been upheld.
So on page 8, and we're gonna have to go back. I circled a lot of these after Megan did the initial revisions. We've got to screen this more carefully. There may be some minor changes where we're removing other references to lower potency throughout, where we're not going to change what we're doing now, and that's no regulation. So that was just in that title. That'll be removed in that title. The next one is on my page 9. And that goes back to this same revision. However we revise public place in the first one, it'll show up in here. And the reason that there are double sets of definitions, they are different chapters of the city code, and so it's appropriate we add those to the licensing provisions, the ones that are relevant. And then these are in the zoning chapter, and so the duplication seems odd. At the bottom of the page, and this isn't on your list, but I'm on page 9 still, and you'll see there I added, in terms of these additions for conditional uses, the lower potency. That'll be stricken throughout. So those additions were placeholders. They'll all be removed. The next one is pages 9 and 10. Yeah, that's all of these references, except on page 10 is the first of 2 that I mentioned, where we do want to include in our permitting provisions the lower potency hemp edible manufacturer. That'll be a regular business, and that's appropriate to leave in. But other lower potency hemp generally are going to be eliminated in this process. And I'm on page 11. And this is the other provision about the maximum. You voted on that. This will stay at 3 for the time being. And if you see fit to change that, as Megan said, we can come back and change it. The next comment, and we're going to come back and talk about the ultimate permitting. Janet's asked that we haven't resolved that. Interim use, conditional use. So right now, this is structured differently. The only thing we were talking about interim use permits was in addition to licensing the cannabis events, they would be an interim use. And Janet has asked, are there others in here? And we'll talk about that at the end. Is that fair?
Yeah, can I just ask a question? Because I was reading this in the minutes, and about, you had made the comment, or at least in the minutes, it reflects that the events are private.
Private?
Well, so what it says is, Hagelin asks about current ordinance prohibiting smoking in public in public-facing places, how this plays out with the temporary events. Johnson states that these temporary events are closed and private, making them not a public place. So I'm trying to, if that's true, then that doesn't reconcile with how we're defining it in here. And I don't know if that's just how we're defining public in the context of the events, versus something else, so I'm confused.
Yeah, and I'd have to go back and listen to the tape, how that, if that was taken out of context. It should, if I actually use the definition that we're debating, public place, that's different than, public itself.
Right.
I think the point is, right now, under the state's, and this is another thing that Eleanor, Megan, and I talked about, the state, it's not clear, but in certain sections, it becomes more clear that these cannabis temporary events are a one and done licensing provision with the state. And originally, that was not clear in the statutes. And we think it's one and done. So if somebody gets an event license, they're going to get it for an event that is announced to the state. They would send that to us. We would still license that event. And then we have to determine, the language is that we would issue an interim use permit for that temporary event. Now, I don't know if this is clouding the question that you initiated. The location of these is going to be, for all intents and purposes, unless it's like a circus event where somebody's got a traveling show and they've got their own fencing, they got their own lighting, they've got their own security system, and they've got tents that they're going to put up. These are going to be in existing buildings, and we don't have any. I mean, we don't have that venue set up right now for this event. Could somebody come in and say the whole lower level of the hotel is going to be a temporary event? Potentially. But that's one of the few places in the community, in my mind, that you're going to see this. And so our regulations for those temporary events is a structure. It's not going to be a tent environment. That was one of my questions to the state, that they said, ask your attorney.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and just to go back to how the public place definition is utilized within the zoning ordinance, it's specifically tied to prohibitions on public consumption. So it says that no person shall use cannabis flower, cannabis products, or lower potency hemp edibles. Let's just circle that.
Tell me where you're reading, please.
I'm so sorry. This is on page 11 of 13, section 4, 7A-825D, under public consumption. In a public place or a place of public accommodation, unless the premise is an establishment or an event licensed to permit on-site consumption of adult use. So we have our place of public accommodation, which is what's going to capture all of your licensed retail facilities. And then you have your public place, which is going to capture all of the property owned by the city of Columbus or other public venues. That again, those are definitions that feed into the overall restriction here, which is that in order to hold an event and consume these products on site that are the high potency, full THC, all of the things, those people need to be licensed, and they also need to have a conditional use permit or an interim use permit to establish their use.
So what I'm thinking about is, once a year, say Running Aces comes in, they get an event permit. They have multiple things that are listed under each of those. And that might be true, I think about the dog. I mean, obviously they're not going to be selling THC at the little, whippet races, but that was another example where there was multiple events all under the same permit, because they just so how would that work for this? So let's say that Running Aces decides that they want to include this in some of their events or maybe even all of their events. So they come through and they get their event permit from us, like they have in the past. We're going to do, A, B, C, D, E. This is what's going to happen there, and we're going to sell THC at each of them. When you say it's one and done, I don't understand that.
That's the state. So the state has an authorization for someone to be an event organizer. They get the state's license. And it appears, best as we can determine, that it's one time. So to use your question or analogy about Running Aces, they could come to us and say, we intend to go to the state once a year. to be licensed for a temporary event. Can we add that to our list of other interim uses that you grant annually? Well, part of that, if you remember, we required very specific information depending on what the event was.
Right.
Security, you're hiring outside cops, where is it? Is it closed to underage persons? We'd have to get all of that. But yes, I think you could add it to their annual list, and one of the conditions would be that you obtain the state license. And it's one and done because there is no renewal provision, annual renewal provision for an event organizer. It's the only category. Everything else is licensed.
So you're saying a place like Running Aces would go to the state, they would give them a license for an event forever?
No. They get it, they have to submit the dates, and they have to submit all of the participants. The statute was clear. It said up until 3 days before the event, you can change in writing to us who's coming if there's a change right up at the last minute.
So that license won't take 6 to 12 months to get, like the retail one?
Again, we could be set up to where we can respond to them quickly. How long it'll take the state, I can't tell you, because the application by any event organizer is date-specific, it's people-specific, it's location-specific. And I think that's why they ultimately said, this isn't an annual license that gets renewed, because the venues are potentially changing all the time.
So I'm thinking the closest analogy in terms of existing regulations is something along the lines of charitable gaming. So when you have organizations come in and seek a charitable gaming permit for you for a particular event, that is the model I think that's being replicated here. And so I think the structure of how it will work at the state is you have an event promoter who has an established relationship, has all of the paperwork put together, is a reoccurring user, and has already a background check on file with the state. They'll go to the state, they'll receive their event permit to hold their cannabis event in Columbus, Minnesota. The state will then say, are these events allowed in the zoning district in Columbus, Minnesota? They will simultaneously be contacting staff and asking for an interim use permit to operate a cannabis event on X date. A contingency of our interim use permit will always be that they're fully licensed by the state and that they have a temporary event permit in hand on the date of the event. The event will then occur, assuming they get their state permit, and then their interim use permit will automatically cease upon the completion of the event. And then if they wish to do it again the next year, they would go through that whole process all over again.
So is there a difference between an event that has been organized simply to sell cannabis products versus an event for other things, but there happen to be selling cannabis products just because they're also selling alcohol? Or they would sell alcohol, but they're going to sell, so that's what I was trying to get my head wrapped around, is like, is this speaking just to the events that are being created simply to sell the product? Or is this for events where the organizer may choose to also sell THC products along with whatever else they're doing at the event?
Can we sell alcohol and cannabis at the same
No.
event? We can't do that.
That's in the statute.
Yeah.
But they might sell it instead of, is what my
Have
point.
tobacco
yeah.
or alcohol.
Well, that's a retail, right? So it's getting confusing to me because I can see more the latter, where somebody has an event, people are going there to recreate, they want to be able to sell this as part of the event, but that's not the purpose of the event. See what I mean? It's more just part of the recreating part of their.
I don't think that the flexibility that you have, for example, for alcohol, where like, for example, the Lions can set up their area at Fall Fest to sell alcohol, I don't think that there's a mirror image of that concept yet in the state, and it certainly isn't within your ordinance at this point in time.
So the example that Lynn brought up, where somebody wants to sell THC at Fall Fest as part of a product, that would not, right now, that's not being contemplated.
So I think they would need to have, I don't believe that it works underneath the statutory construct because a retail license has to be tied to a physical space. And I think that's probably where you'll have your low potency hemp edible providers sort of sitting in that role as vendors. But that certainly would be an area for us to explore to see if there is some guidance about a more vendor relationship as compared to a cannabis event, which is really, sort of like a cannabis convention is the way I think of it.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm confused about. I understand that concept, but I would guess that we would have, especially with Running Aces, that, they may at some point want to do this as part of their event that they're sponsoring, and they have a lot of them. And if they had it somewhere separate, then, like they had it in the hotel where they don't sell alcohol, but in the casino you can get alcohol. I don't know how we deal with that, but.
Well, I want to try and hit a couple of things that came up. Lynn asked earlier about a low potency activity. One of the regulations that was added to the list under licensing is a state requirement, and that's one that will not be pulled out. You can't use a vending machine for any products, including low potency, and the state law regulates age for the sales of low potency. Okay? Everybody's got to be 21, and none of those products, not full cannabis, not low potency, can be given away as samples. So if your person said, I want to come to Fall Fest and give away some gummy bears, they can't do it. In spite of the fact that we don't currently regulate it, the state is regulating it, and there's no samples. You got to be 21, and you can't have vending machines.
I just don't see anybody wanting to spend the money to get a license for Fall Fest. I only asked about the low potency because she has a store in Forest Lake, and she does that. But as far as cannabis, who's going to want to spend that much money for an event like that?
And you'd have to be sitting here in the guise of Fall Fest, which is family-oriented. Are you really encouraging that kind of activity? I wouldn't think so. No. It has to be totally secure. You have to manage all entrances and exits at temporary events. You have to separate sales areas for each vendor. So this is a multi-room or parceled off area where each vendor has their own spot. They can't, at temporary events, have free products. You can't have samples in any of these. And you can't use vending machines. And so I think we do need to look up, is there a way for somebody to do hemp products at your event like we do in the Lions for 3-2 beer for the weekend? I don't, it's complicated, and I don't know that the rules are there, Megan.
I don't think they are. So the statute doesn't have good guidance, and the guidance on OCM does not really draw a distinction between these two things. So I think that's a gray area that's yet to be explored.
I have a question, Dean. What can we do to make this as simple as possible for staff? I mean, if you sold a semi-load of gummy bears, it would make no difference to the city.
It would have started with having one instead of three.
Huh?
I said it would have started with having one instead of three.
Well.
So simplicity, I think, for people that are familiar with the business, it isn't going to be complicated. How they're going to get through the licensing, maybe because there were almost 1,200 out of 1,800 applications rejected, period, out of the list. So there's some 600-700 left, and out of those, the pool to issue licenses is limited to 250 some businesses. That includes all retail, all manufacturing, all growing, everything. So first of all, they got near 2,000 applications. 1,200 were rejected for whatever reason. If you see that article, 2 attorneys were grousing why they got rejected and it's not fair and whatever. But there's still 800 applications out there, and they're going through the lottery to pick 250 or 42, or I've got the number here. In any event, when it comes to us, the market is going to dictate. You don't have a grocery store. You know why? You don't have the mass. You don't have bodies in this community. You haven't got a liquor store. You got places where you can buy 3-2 beer. You got the hotel, or the racetrack rather, where you can buy real liquor. They don't have any package sales at the racetrack. So those temporary events would allow those Lions and 3-2 temporary permits on the weekend. But the simplicity of this, when you have all your regulations in place and the applicant has a license from the state and they do want to come here and it fits our ordinance, they're going to open up and be no different, except you got to do the compliance checks once a year. You're going to be subject to complaints and other things. And I don't know if you saw in the paper over the weekend or last week, the office raided a place in North Minneapolis that was selling low potency at 20 times the legal limit. Yikes. 20 times. So, I mean, that's a whole nother animal.
Is that Flora? I can't remember the name. It was like a kind of like a concept like a wine bar, only it was like a THC bar. And they were very popular, and they got lots of good press.
20 times, that's,
And now she's closing because she's done.
That's out of our realm. And somebody that went there, probably liked to be a good customer, was overwhelmed at the potency and blew the whistle. And that's only going to get worse.
I think the paper said they actually had to call an ambulance to pick somebody up who presumably could have OD'd on it.
The first time that there were complaints, somebody from the state would go in and all the employees in the back were hustling stuff out the back door. So the next time they went in, they put people in the alley first, and then they caught them, and they had all this product, and anyway, they were able to test it, and it was lethal. But that's out of our realm too.
Right.
But I think the simplicity here is what you expect in these shops, is that somebody is not able, they can have a jar with flowering buds in it and take the lid off and let you smell it. But the other edible products, whether in a can or gummies that are full potency, they're pre-packaged. When you walk in a store, there's no touching or sampling. They are packaged. Somebody opens a microbrewery or micro business, and they're going to have a tasting room. They have to buy the product in a retail environment, bring the product in its original packaging, and sit down at the tables and have music and whatever food and all of that. And they're using it in state-approved packaging. But those micro places do not allow alcohol or tobacco, and I believe there's no vaping in there. One of the things that we still haven't talked about is, and I think a reason to license the events, but also issue an interim use permit, is to determine on the basis of a real application how you feel about on-site consumption. Because right now, that's what we say. The hours and the consumption are going to be determined case by case. And whether you ever get one or not, I don't know. But I think then, based on all of the information that you have, yeah, we're going to be in the hotel at Running Aces, and we're going to block off the entire lower level, and it's whatever, and here's our security. You make the decision when you issue the interim use permit if it's on-site consumption. Are they geared up for that? You determine the hours of operation. We know it won't exceed 4 days. That's the state law. So they're going to be licensed for that, and it's up to us to determine if we're going to let them have the on-site consumption. In the micro business, we're saying you are allowing consumption, but that isn't smoking the flower. That isn't vaping the heavy-duty products. That's getting a high dose, not low potency, regular potency Is that what you're drinking there, Rob? Oh.
Yeah.
It's the real deal, and people are going in there and sitting at tables listening to music and having food. It'll be like a tavern.
Wish.
And for some of that stuff, I mean, it's been a long time for me, but you can get pretty goofy in there. I don't know about going home. So, I didn't mean to get off the track.
What's next?
I'm on item number 17, which was page 11, and Megan raised the question that currently the setback provisions we had for any of these businesses were the maximum that the state allowed. And she noted that, well, you know, we have the alcohol on sale that is 500 feet. It's kind of a non-issue because we're going to take lower potency out of there. And then you wouldn't have that conflict. So the only alcohol, or the only thing that would be impacted, and I don't know that you want to reduce the city of St. Paul and Minneapolis. Well, Megan highlighted it. I think I gave you some earlier articles when they were developing their ordinances. You know how all those neighborhoods are. You don't go more than 5 blocks and you got a little commercial area. And they said, if we had 1,000 feet setback from every school or whatever, this is how many retailers we could have. And they couldn't reach the maximum number of licenses based on their population. So they cut it down to 300 feet. And we left ours at 1,000 feet. We don't have any schools or any of these in our retail corridors anyway. It really is a non-issue. But the minute we pull out lower potency, which is the only thing that's potentially a setback issue with those gas stations, we still don't have a problem. We talked about hours operation. We're going to parallel whatever the state has or match that to your liquor licensing. And then the last unresolved thing from our last meeting was talking about the use of conditional use permitting and interim use permitting. And I know Janet felt strongly about let's do IUPs for everything. As I've talked in the past, and Megan kind of highlighted some things in her memo, the only thing that I feel falls into the category of an interim use with either a date certain or an event certain is the retail provisions. The state right now is issuing a license which is annually renewed as long as they meet their requirements. So the date is open. It keeps going annually. But an event would be if they lose their license. And we're going to say anytime anybody loses their license, they lose ours. Technically, on the retail, you could parallel the issuance of a retail license and say that the event certain of that, if we use an interim use permit on the retail businesses, is if they lose their license. And that would answer the question that Janet has always brought up. Well, you know, if they lose the business, the CUP runs with the land. I would not want any of these other businesses, the manufacturers, the wholesalers, the other businesses that are investing in real property using the interim use rather than the conditional use. So my comment, and Megan and Eleanor and I talked about this in our last conversation, and Janet, you would appreciate that Bill said, now listen, there is a way, and we feel if you felt strongly about limiting some of the businesses like the event to an interim use permit, that it be those that we are licensing, which is strictly the retail. So then the other businesses, you would leave the way they are shown in the ordinance as conditional use permits. So a manufacturer, we're not going to get a grower. We're just not. Even though they're all indoor and they could, I just don't see us doing that. But I could be wrong. In any event, we don't care. If they meet the ordinance, we would do that. But when somebody is developing a major new facility like that, it's really tough issuing interim use permits because the banks, they won't get any financing. They just don't. And so I'm giving an out, Janet,
I'm not convinced.
with Megan's blessing, that we could tie the retail licensing with interim uses for retail business, but neither of us are comfortable going with all of the cannabis businesses without conditional use. Did I say that correctly, Megan?
I think you absolutely did. So I think the other thing to consider here is how we what are the physical structures and the impacts of a particular use. Yes, having a conditional use for, let's say, a grower would allow another grower to come in. At any point in time within that conditional use, a condition of that operation on the site would be that they have an active growing license and are able to meet all of the performance standards that you've outlined in your conditional use permit. And the same thing, of course, is true with the interim use permit for your retailer. You can set that to the date certain. In the event that they lose their license, that be revoked, that the interim use permit will immediately cease and they will no longer have the underlying zoning rights to operate at that site, coupled with, of course, their local license and their state license as well. Because it would be, in terms of our process, it would be unlikely that we would revoke a local license if there was also not a state revocation process going on at the same time.
So where I was coming from was that because there's so many unknowns. I mean, we met with Representative Nolan West, who was on the committee who drafted the original ordinance. He couldn't answer one of these questions. He's like, I don't know, if I was me, I'd try to like keep it as small and as like defined and as contained as possible, because this law is going to change 1,000,000 times. It's just going to get rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And every time it does, you will have to update your ordinances. So we just signed our checks last week. I believe it was a $6,000 check to our law firm for the work that's been done so far on this ordinance. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm not against this in principle. I'm saying since we keep hearing from Dean, we're not going to get one anyway. The only one retail establishment that I think we'll hear from that might want to do it will be Running Aces, because they've already got a gambling and a liquor license and they've already got the infrastructure to support that. I'd be cool with that. I'd be cool to just restricting the retail to the horse racing district, because then they're the only ones that can do it. It doesn't matter if we get 3 applications. They own all the land there. So that gives us like ultimate control for these really uncertain times now. And as Dean said, we can expand it beyond that when things get better defined. If you're talking about manufacturing or growing or any of those other kinds of things, with a CUP, it will run with the business. So what happens if you let one, pick a spot somewhere on Lake Drive or wherever, and you have this and it turns out it's kind of a disaster, and they go out of business, but now they're selling it to another group that is going to do the same thing in that same building, where you'd rather have the opportunity because it was not so well defined. We were willing to shake the dice and see how it went. It didn't work very well. We really don't want it there anymore. You're stuck. It's a CUP.
Well, so what I would suggest to you is that if you have an ongoing operator who is creating nuisance conditions in violation of your CUP, that's exactly the type of situation where revocation of a conditional use permit is appropriate.
And when have we ever done that?
Well, because we have been able to manage those nuisance conditions, right? Either through vacation, a business is not functioning well, or it is able to clean up its act and otherwise, move forward. The other thing that I would think about is that, in terms of a grower or a manufacturer, those are going to be expensive businesses. And their lenders are going to need, if they're establishing and building a building to be able to accommodate this use, are going to need some certainty that that use will be able to continue to operate, because very likely, the lender will be investing in the building as the collateral, right? And so then the lender knows that with the granting of a conditional use permit for a manufacturing facility within the city of Columbus, there is something of value, even if this particular client is unable to make it work. And so I think that is, so number one, you have your performance standards that will be tied to any of the uses. Number two, you have the opportunity for revocation if it becomes a long-standing problem that cannot be remedied through your code enforcement process. And number three, the right type of performance standards should lead to an efficient operator that's able to invest in, what will essentially be an expensive building, an expensive build out to be able to accommodate the use, and will assist them in sort of bringing that to fruition through traditional lending relationships. And then lastly, any future user would need to come in and comply with all of those conditions of the conditional use permit, especially in the event that there had been longstanding issues with the city. That would be one of the first things they would look at. And then lastly, your conditional use permits, if they are not used and the building is vacant for a period of time, and I think it's 2 years within the code, 1 year.
12 months.
12 months, those then do expire, right? So if the use is not marketable and it's not something that is efficient and functioning within the site, then there's some sort of market realities, I think, that can also drive and protect the city on the back end. And then finally, the risk is the event certain, right? The nature of an IUP requires us to have either a date certain, an event certain, or another known period, right? It has to be established. It has to be able to be materially determined at the time you approve the IUP resolution. So there is also the scenario, right, where a manufacturer is violating the terms and conditions of their IUP and you revoke the IUP, or that they are able to retain their state license as a not great operator, but not consistent with what you're looking for, and that IUP continues on, because we would only be able to, in terms of us figuring out what a date certain would look like, the only thing we have to tie it to in the IUP context is that state licensure.
And I get that, but all these businesses have to go through an annual renewal of their license, right? So when you talk about, lenders having some certainty, they don't have any certainty. If they don't get renewed the next year, boom, they're done, right? And they're, at least from what I understand, they're not going through a typical lending process because most of the banks can't finance it. So they're going through some other sort of, venture capitalist sort of thing or whatever. So it's not like, getting a restaurant built and you go to the bank and you take out a loan. It doesn't work that way for these kinds of businesses, at least the way that it is right now. So the only point, it's not that I'm trying to say we should not let these businesses in. I'm just saying there's so many moving parts to this. And you could approve the use in an area today and have the state law change 17 different ways that now we don't really like it there, because when we approved it, they didn't have those rights or permissions or whatever you want to call it. And now they do, because the state has said that. So then you're locked in with the CUP. So that's why I think until things settle down a bit, I'd be more comfortable with the IUP. It's less about whether somebody goes in there and creates a nuisance problem. It's more about you approve it under one set of assumptions, because that's what the law says today, and the law is going to get changed, by the people who are making the laws. They're saying, yeah, it's going to change a whole bunch. We don't really know what we're doing. And now you might end up with something that it wasn't what you originally approved, and you're locked into it because it's a CUP.
Yes, that's true. To the extent that you have independent definitions within this ordinance, right? And they're the definitions that exist now and the performance standards that you're adopting now. So irrespective of the state process, certainly on the licensure side, right? They could loosen up the licensure requirements and potentially allow people who are not as, or businesses who are not as well vetted to operate a manufacturing site. But in terms of your ordinance itself, the things that, and how you would approve a conditional use permit, those standards are going to remain no matter what happens at the state law. So there's that on the back end. And again, the risk is just being able to have a date certain and not, so just from a legislative history standpoint, conditional use permits and interim use permits originated from special use permits, which was the term that was used in the 1970s and in the early 80s. And those special use permits could be like a conditional use permit, absolutely apply for time immemorial, or they could be like an interim use permit with ending upon a date certain. And so the legislature created these two sections, and the litigation over which one you have in the recent years does make a difference. The risk with the interim use permit, and it's just a policy risk for your consideration, is that by having sort of an ill-defined or a not clearly defined end date that we can control, right? Because we control licensure of retail businesses, we control licensure of temporary events. When we have a date that's controlled by the state agency, then that just means that it opens us up for an argument that a property owner will say, well, actually, this was a conditional use permit. It morphed into a conditional use permit because your date certain wasn't legally sufficient under the law, and I'm entitled to these underlying property rights because I've made these investments and all of those types of things. And so that's sort of the nuance between how you regulate these two things, and that's not a for sure risk at all, but just something for your consideration. Either path is going to allow you to adopt performance standards, is going to allow you to ensure that the businesses that you're inviting into Columbus are successful based upon the standards that the council and the planning commission set.
Could I offer one comment? Janet, you had mentioned it would be nice to rely on keeping the retail limited to the racetrack. I would have, and I'm not the attorney here, but I would have serious concerns when you have one owner, one zoning district. It really falls into the category of successful challenges under spot zoning, that we've picked one district for a particular use that is not available to anyone other than that.
Well, and I think on a long-term basis, you're probably right, but what I'm saying is that they have a track record of complying with those licenses, and we have no other business in Columbus that has that track record.
I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I think they're a wonderful business. It's just that if anyone wanted to challenge you that you restricted all of your retail opportunities to one zoning district that was one owner, you're going to get a challenge.
Well, we do that for their core business. That's the only place you can do racing and gambling.
And that was a state category that also says there's only going to be two, one on the north side and one on the south side. We got the standard bred, they got the thoroughbred, and that's a whole different can of worms. If you were simply saying we'll only allow a grocery store in the racetrack district and somebody wanted one somewhere else, they're going to successfully fight the option that you haven't opened that up as an opportunity to everyone. You've restricted it to one person.
And I understand that argument. I'm looking at it from the perspective of it's the city's responsibility to license and ensure compliance with this moving target of rules and regulations. And so in order to, in Jesse's words, make this as simple as possible, you start with the least risky scenario, and then you go, broader as things get better defined. And to me, that would be the least risky, the least work, and still meet the letter of the law. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying forever. I'm just saying that unlike your grocery store, we aren't responsible for inspecting them and making sure that they meet all the requirements. We will be for these businesses. So why not start with a business that, and I don't even know that they will want to do this, but I mean, if they did, I would feel so much more comfortable because we have a track record with them, and they've been compliant with everything that they need to be compliant with. They've not had any violations. So that's my point.
If they happen to be the first one in, and they would be able to do that.
Yeah, if we only have one.
And then if somebody else beat them to it, you come back and amend your ordinance and open it up for another one.
I'm really I'm going at it with the intent of, let's keep this as simple as possible and as least expensive as possible, because it's a moving target. And the state has admittedly said they don't really know what they're doing, and it's going to change a lot. You hardly ever hear that, right? I mean, you might think that, but they hardly ever admit that. But they've admitted that.
We'll see changes. So I know you were time conscious. I'm not as concerned as I was last July that we really needed to have something by the end of the year, but we're close. And that's up to you also. Are there other issues that we did not talk about tonight that you would like to talk about?
I don't have any, but I was just curious if we were going to get a consensus on this PUD, IUP topic. Do you need that?
Yes.
Okay, because we
need
can,
that.
I mean, we've all heard all the information, so we should maybe do kind of like what we did with the vote of the 1 or 3.
I think if I could reiterate what both Megan and I have said, without stretching the limits of how the law exists now and a lot of legal challenges that have occurred over the years about permitting, our comfort level would be any of these retail. We're talking the micro business, we're talking the events, and any other retail operation which falls into our categories of licensing provisions. We could rely on not date certain, because they have an open-ended renewal or annual renewal that could be 3 years or it could be 40, but the event certain that we can put through our licensing provision if they lose that license, which automatically occurs if the state revokes it, then we could do the IUPs for all those retail activities. But I think our recommendation, all the other businesses, the wholesale, the manufacturer, the trucking or transporting, the low hemp edible manufacturing would all fall under the conditional use permitting for the normal reasons that apply to not having a good event certain, and we certainly don't have a date certain because they're not under our licensing provision. So that's kind of what's on the table if you were inclined to try to vote it one way or another.
Dean, would you repeat that? The last section.
So right now under
just the CUP part.
Yeah.
Who gets the CUP?
Well, so right now under the licensing provisions that have been amended, all of the retail licenses that you could issue, that includes a store, a dispensary, it includes the micro business, it includes the temporary event, would be interim use.
Okay, so somebody who's just going to slap something up, it's a IUP. If you're going to build a 10,000 square foot cement building, then they get a CUP.
Yeah, if it requires a license through our new licensing provisions, we could issue an interim use permit. If it doesn't go under our licensing provision, which means, again, wholesalers, manufacturers, growers, none of those are in our licensing provision. They're in the straight zoning category. Our comfort level is that those other businesses, as likely or unlikely as they may be coming here, would be the conditional use.
Well,
as simple as I can.
I think they would be unlikely,
Pardon?
but if they had to follow performance standards and build a big tip-up building to grow your pot in, so that eliminates a lot of riffraff or whatever you want to say, and it would be people who are substantial business people, possibly. So, because I understand Janet's concerns, and we know this whole pot thing is questionable from the day it started, in my mind, but it's the law, so.
Well, it's just not been well-defined. I mean, I'm not making any value judgment about whether it's questionable or not. So can I just ask one?
Yep.
So those other businesses, we are not responsible for compliance with those. Manufacturing, we're not responsible for compliance.
No,
Just the retail, the micro, and the event.
that is correct.
Okay. Then I feel better about what you just said.
Okay.
As long as,
I think, again, based upon the number of existing buildings and the zoning districts that you're allowing things, you don't have space available. So you're really talking about the majority of these businesses needing to build up from scratch. And yes, whether they're growing, whether they're manufacturing other products, whether they're in a transport business, they have to meet all of our other design standards, everything else, whether it requires a tip up or it has to meet the design standards.
yep.
If they were to come in and take over one of the other businesses, as your animal business took over the exercise guys building, you only got a couple more of those, and they're not big enough and sophisticated enough for manufacturing, but they could possibly hold, you might get a retailer in one of those locations.
But a retailer, we can IUP.
Yeah,
But-
I'm not making that distinction. I'm just trying to say there are a lot of empty buildings in Bloomington, Minneapolis, St. Paul that are almost ready for somebody to move into. We don't have those. And so our biggest concern, other than the retail, and we're talking about retail shops that are half the size of this room. It's not an enormous investment. They could fit into some of your buildings. The others aren't going to. And that's a big concern I have, distinguishing between the interim use, which if it's limited to the retail business, we can justify event certain. If they lose their license, they're done. You're out. And that site, wherever they were, new or used, is not automatically open for the next person. But somebody builds a manufacturing or a growing facility, and growing is not enormous either. I mean, we're talking 5,000 feet for a certain category, 10,000. The state can increase those. We're not talking acres under roof. So it isn't like Burgeon's, wanting to come in. But again, all of those that would get potentially the conditional use have to meet all their other zoning standards. And if they collapsed, whether they lost a state license or just closed the door, that vacancy period, I think it's 12. If it's 24 months,
I think you're right. I think it's 12.
once that time frame is done, then that conditional use expires. But I will tell you one lawsuit we were involved in, and that was a closed gas station. And it was empty for 5 years. And we all had plans for what it was going to become. And we said, no, you can't reuse that. And they came in and said, we've been storing oil in the ground in those containers all this time. And the judge said, yeah, they never abandoned the property. So there are ways people can sneak around you.
Never trust the judge. All right.
Okay.
Is there a consensus then to IUP the pot shops and CUP the big business?
Make the question.
Just say aye.
Just say,
Or you can stay till 9 o'clock, your choice.
what's the question?
Here,
Well, do we agree with what
Dean, will you
Dean just
rephrase?
explained?
I'll just rephrase quickly. An IUP for any retail business that is getting licensed in the first provisions in your ordinance would be an IUP. All other cannabis businesses would get a CUP.
Okay. So you're waiting for me. Aye, I'll go along with that.
Aye, Bethany.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Oop, sorry.
Aye.
Aye.
Yes.
Robin?
Since we're not voting, right?
How about Robin?
Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
All right,
Up, okay.
well, that takes care of that.
Anything else that you can think about that maybe isn't covered in here? I spent a lot more time personally on trying to establish the new retail licensing provisions than I did go back and look at this. I need to do it again. Megan will go through this again, but we will take out all references in here that imply any type of regulation, restriction, whatever for low potency. That'll be different from what you've seen. And we will put all of the retail businesses now in these various zoning districts that allow any of the retail, will convert those from CUP to IUP.
Can I ask just one quick question about low potency? This is for you. This is a pop quiz because I don't remember.
Okay.
If you're doing a home occupation, is retail off the market? They can't do retail out from a home occupation. Could they sell low potency from their home? Or did we, and the reason I say that is because we've talked about none of this stuff for the high potency can be in the rural residential. But if we're not going to regulate the low potency
stuff?
could that be done in the residential? I'm just asking the question.
Just a quick question. Didn't we change that to say that any retail sales associated with a legal home occupation is incidental? So if you're a hairdresser, you sell shampoo.
Yeah.
How is selling hemp?
I don't know, but I'm bringing it up because I bet that might be.
It wouldn't be a
should figure it
retail
out.
store. Did we qualify for any sort of like because home delivery stuff with the low potency might become a thing? Sorry, this is also.
Well, maybe you guys can look into it. That's just a question. I'm not saying
Yeah.
yes or no to it. I'm just saying I think we might have opened up a question mark if we
Yeah,
say we
that is a
don't
good
regulate it. And then I don't know how it would fit into if somebody wanted to try to sell it as part of their home occupation. And I don't know that we, would say no to that. I just say we should figure it out.
Yeah, I do believe that the retail would have to be incidental to their home occupation. However, it's the same thing where if people were making homemade crocheted items, if someone is making homemade low potency hemp products and storing them in there.
Yeah, they're not
Whole
going to get a
bar.
license to manufacture low
No.
potency, so we
Okay,
don't worry
no.
about that. And I think that's the best connection. Somebody can make birdhouses, and yes, they can sell them as a true home occupation.
Yeah.
But how the sale of lower potency would be accessory to a legitimate business, I'm not getting it, but we'll look into that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So much for the cannabis. Let's do the number 7, Planning Commissioner's report.
I have nothing, Bethany.
Speaking of weed, did you guys see that there was marijuana growing all over the ditch?
What?
Yeah, hilarious.
Where?
Kettle River. It's just point of interest, really. It was like wild marijuana, just like growing in the ditch. I didn't know what it was. My husband pointed it out.
All right.
No, I really didn't. He was like, "There's weed," and I was like, "Oh, weeds?" And he was like, "No, like weed, weed growing in the ditch, like so much of it." Just a fun fact.
Thank you.
It's gone now, but it was there.
Somebody already grabbed it.
It's in your basement drying, right?
After the county mowed it, there's a bunch of people out there gathering it up.
I didn't know how tall they were.
Nothing for me. Scott?
So tall.
Nope, nothing. Thank you.
Susan?
Nothing.
And welcome, and thanks for coming, and we hope you come back
Thank you.
after a meeting like this.
And Robin?
And Robin, anything?
Nothing there. All right, that takes care of that. City Administrator and Planning and Zoning Tech Report.
I would like to ask if you would like to officially call for a public hearing for this ordinance. The next available public hearing would be December 18th, I believe. Actually, let me double check that.
Wednesday, December 18th?
December 18th would be the next available date for a public hearing. Otherwise, we can keep talking about this.
I would say call for the hearing.
Hearing.
Do we feel ready for that, Dean and Megan?
That's the
What is the publication date, the latest?
The latest publication date, sorry, I'm going to bring up my little calendar in the corner, would be December 5th. It would have to be in the newspaper.
Is that the Monday after Thanksgiving? So we have next week to get this wrapped up.
Monday after Thanksgiving is the 2nd, but it's that week.
Okay, it's that week. It comes out on the 5th? Or it comes out on Monday?
It comes out on the 5th.
Okay, so we
we
have to
usually-
have, for anybody that requests, when they see that notice, we have to have the document. So that's our deadline for
Okay.
changes.
Do we feel okay with that, or?
We should do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for all your work on the ordinance.
Yes.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, Sue had said earlier tonight, we've got to get this done before I leave. So, there you go.
There you go.
Get her done.
Okay.
So you have consensus?
I have consensus.
Okay.
I can post that public hearing date. Thank you.
Perfect.
So we did it before the first of the year, that's good.
We,
Yep.
Jack, anything from you? No. And in that case, I'll make the motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
I'll second.
I'll call for the vote.
Go ahead. Aye.
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 Scott, aye.
Janet, aye.
Susan, aye.
Rabbi. Robin? Aye. Dean, you ready to go?
No, good job.
All right, and the mayor says aye. And also, everyone, happy Thanksgiving. By the time we get back,
Are you bringing it?
it'll be
Darn right.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah.